So I'm torn. I could talk about patience today. I've been really struggling with that. But I also want to talk about calling in ministry. Last week I talked about worship and shared some things that were on my heart. So why don't I do that again? Well, hey everyone, my name is Andrew Geist, and welcome to Anything Goes: A Journey Home, a place for you to be encouraged and connected and hopefully supported as I share my life and my journey with you. You may have noticed that tagline changes every time. Get used to it. I'm still figuring it out. I know some of you might be wondering, Andrew, where do you get your awesome hats? First off, I want to say I'm not paid by anybody on this podcast in any way, shape, or form. And this wonderful hat comes courtesy of artofhomage.com. I encourage you to check them out. I really love this shop's stuff. It's very minimal, and then sometimes it gets really creative and very colorful. Some of that's not my taste, but in general, I really love the stuff because it's super simple and it's very, very cool looking, and it really suits my style. So I'm glad that you're here with me today. As I said, patience, and a little bit about calling. Patience is not something I'm terribly good at. My wife will tell you when I'm driving, I'm the worst at patience. People cut me off, I get super frustrated, super fast. And I oftentimes lose my patience in the privacy of my own vehicle, and to my shame, don't always have the best words and thoughts in my head when those things happen. And truthfully, where I live in Houston, that happens a lot. So God, thanks for testing me. Nevertheless, patience and calling actually kind of go hand in hand. I was reading a devotional today about the importance of being patient with an idea and sharing that idea once it's actually become a fully flushed out concept. Maybe that's an episode for another day of how you take an idea that you have, specifically like songwriting or some type of artistic expression, and bring it from this idea into some kind of flushed out, completed thought. It's not always easy, and it's not always a perfect process. But man, it's so exciting when God engages with you in creativity and inspires you in that way. And in many respects, patience in calling, especially in ministry, is crucial. Because as you'll find out in just a moment, when you're called to something, you might think it has to happen right now. The reality is it's not on our time. When God calls us, it's on His time. As I said, when God calls us, it's on His time. And who better to be the example of patience than God? For crying out loud, He was patient for hundreds, if not thousands of years with many countless people not following through on the call that He had on their lives. One of those people was David and Saul. A few other people might be Peter, the disciple. Yet God was patient, and Jesus was patient for them to finally wake up and realize, oh, that's what you're wanting me to do? Oh, okay, I can do that. In today's day and age, it's no different. The truth is, God was patient with me in my call. For those of you who've not heard my testimony before, I want to share a little bit of it with you. When I gave my life to Christ in 2011, I was originally shooting for being the next great film composer like John Williams. You know, Jurassic Park, ba-da-da. I'm not going to do that because I don't have the money to pay him. But you get my point. I had dreams and ambitions that were big. And I made some connections, and I started to make my way into that world, and I started to quickly realize the kind of person I would have to become. And I wasn't sure if I was that person in my heart. I didn't know if I had the cutthroat mentality or the business-minded acumen to really go after it and sell my creative efforts and energies in music. Now, I still occasionally write songs, and I still share those things with people, but not nearly in the capacity that I originally thought God wanted me to go on. I started to work on some film projects that nobody would have heard of, and some of them were quite suspect, to the point that the content of it, I felt, was going to reflect poorly on my character. Like, stuff that I wouldn't want to write home to my mom and dad about. Stuff that people who find out that I put my name on those things would quickly say, "You're okay with all that stuff? You say you call yourself a Christian. Why would you put your name on something like that?" That was the crossroads. And I made a decision. Fortunately, because of my wife. My wife has always been a tuning fork for me in this journey of life. Whenever I find myself struggling and I find myself feeling like I'm losing my path or wandering aimlessly without direction, not knowing how to process or move forward in the next phase of life, I always go to her, and I metaphorically hit that tuning fork to see what God is telling her. Because the reality is as a man, it's so easy for us to just get into this habitual pattern of do, go, conquer the world, and record this project, and do this thing. And our wives who are lovingly supporting us, and the people in our lives who are loving supporting us, oftentimes have the most unselfish, unbiased perspective on our life and how we're actually doing. And they'll tell us, if we're willing to accept the honesty, that we're not quite where they think we should be or where God wants us to be. And that's what I did with my wife. I laid out the specs of the situation. I had an opportunity in front of me to become an intern at a mid-level recording studio, to potentially work my way up over however many years or decades to become eligible to actually write and record film music. But to do so was likely going to cost me my dignity and require me to be essentially an indentured servant. As we talked through it, my wife was very astute and observant and realized that I wasn't very happy telling her all of these things. And she helped me see that. And I made the decision to move away from that life and pursue what I resisted for a very long time after I gave my life to Christ, which was his call on my life to use my gifts and talents for his kingdom. And I'll tell you what, he was patient because he waited 25 years for me to figure it out. Nevertheless, I made that turn, and I started going down that path of call. But I thought, as soon as I turned, that it was going to immediately turn into open door, open window, open this, open that. And this church was going to want me because I'm so amazing. I was in LA and I was doing all this music. I'm incredibly talented. But that didn't happen. In fact, it actually took my wife encouraging me to step away from LA and move back closer to family in Central California that eventually opened the door for me to work at a church that was, in many ways, a massive learning curve for me as far as church work goes. I learned what I like and what I don't like in church ministry. I learned the importance of boundaries. I learned the importance of trusting people in ministry, which I know for some out there who are Christian believers, what? I can't believe this. We're a sinful world, folks. And churches are no perfect place. They are, in fact, imperfect places full with imperfect people who, unfortunately, as a friend of mine would say, no one is above sinning. No one is above failing. And no one is above going out of their way to do either of those things. And the reality is I learned that in my church in California. Nevertheless, when I came to the end of that most painful experience of my life in ministry, I genuinely thought about giving up my call. But that's the thing about a call, and especially when it's God calling on your life. The best you can do is run from it. But it's still there. It's like your phone. I was born in 1986. I know for some of you that's like, wow, he's such an ancient dude. And for some of you guys, wow, what a kid. I get it. I'm in that middle generation. I'm on the older side of the millennial age. I actually can remember never having a computer. I can actually remember the day I got my first computer. I can remember the day the internet came into our home, and I can remember the day that cell phones first appeared in our house. That's the level of old I am. I know that doesn't mean much to many of you, but the point is that as I've grown older and as I've watched all of these things change in my life, I've begun to realize that God was always calling me. And the reality is that for many of you, the phone has been on your hip this whole time. And we get these phantom feelings in our legs or in our hands or on our wrists and of vibrations in our bodies, as if we're getting a phone call, because we're almost trained, and if not expecting it most of the time to happen. Because we get notifications for everything, which is pretty incredible. And I'm always amazed at the world that we live in today. But the reality is that Jesus is no different. Jesus' message has been around for years. And God's call on our lives have been around for our entire lives. But many of us resist it. Many of us run from it our whole lives. Some of us maybe never discover what it is. And sometimes we assume that our calling is supposed to match our gifting. And that's not always the case. Mine is a pretty unique situation. And for that matter, my gifting is in composition, and my gifting is in singing. But I don't play guitar very well, though I'm learning. I play piano pretty average, but I stay on top of it. And those are all essential parts of being a worship leader in today's day and age. It didn't used to be that way. I remember when there was no such thing as a worship leader. I remember the day that worship leaders started to become a thing. And I still can't believe that Worship Leader magazine actually coined the word worship leader. That's kind of crazy. Nevertheless, it's incredible to me how the worship leader position evolved and how that influenced my call. For years, I grew up listening to Southern gospel music and the Gaither Vocal Band, as well as Michael W. Smith and many more contemporary artists like Amy Grant and so many more, and was influenced by them most of my life growing up. And in my early years, I thought, I'll be a Christian recording artist one day. And I pursued piano because Michael W. Smith was, in a way, my hero. The reality is, as soon as worship leaders became a thing, you know who was the most popular guy at church? Chris Tomlin. I love the guy. But in all honesty, as soon as I realized what my call was and that my purpose was to serve the church with the gifts that he had given me, I realized very quickly that the church had kind of moved on from Michael W. Smith and were all the rage with Chris Tomlin, wanting that famous acoustic guitar player up there at the front of their stage, rocking the house every single Sunday. Fortunately, I wasn't that guy. And for the first 5 years of me realizing that that was my call, I never got any jobs. I never got any calls. I never was taken seriously by many senior pastors because the question always started with, so what do you play, Andrew? Well, I play piano, and I lead from the piano. Oh, okay, cool. Well, thanks anyway. I know it's hard to believe, but it happens, and it's still a thing in this world. Nevertheless, through that whole process, you can imagine one of the things I learned. Patience. There came a time in my season of ministry where I had to be patient. I had to be patient with my call and realize that God was calling me into a life of sacrifice. The reality is when you're called and you want to do ministry, you have to recognize that it's not fun. A lot of people kind of glamorize it and look at it and think, wow, I get to lead all these people to Jesus and this is going to be so incredible. The reality is that Jesus told us that we will actually be persecuted for his name's sake. And that in this world we will have trouble. But the one thing that we can take heart in is that he's overcome the world, and our hope and eternity is secure through his sacrifice. Which means that when we decide to step into our calling and serve in church, we might have to be patient and suffer some tribulation and trials that produce perseverance in our faith. It's not always easy. And in fact, doing ministry and following through on your call in ministry requires a level of patience so significant that you would be patient enough to wait for a reignition of the desire that you once had when you feel burnt out. Or being patient to suffer through the process of healing wounds from people who call themselves Christians who hurt you from the ministries you've served in. Following through on your call means being patient and serving until your season is up. Whether it's by your choice or by the hand of others, being patient and giving your very best to your call and your ministry may be required of you. Those are the things that are always the hardest about serving in ministry. And those are the things that always require of most of us the most patience in our lives, is a willingness to go through the trials and tribulations, knowing that on the other end of that we will bear fruit. And that fruit of the Spirit, one of those things is patience. And we become quite adept at it. And sometimes we have setbacks. Another perfect example of that in our lives can be if we're trying to lose weight. Many of you know that I've been trying to lose weight most of my adult life, and it's always been a struggle of mine. In fact, I found out at the beginning of this year that I actually tacked on a whopping 14 pounds after I'd lost all of that. It was frustrating, but another degree of patience is recognizing if I did it once, I can do it again, and I have to be patient with the process and apply myself to that process again. The same is true of the season of ministry that I'm in now. We've had a transition. Is it one that I was totally thrilled about? Of course not. Does it change anything about what I have to do now? No. My senior pastor is still my senior pastor. He gets to decide where we're going. He's following the leading of the Lord, and I have to trust that he is in tune and listening to the Lord. And I have to be faithful to the reality that sometimes the things that I'm asked to do will be hard for me because they rub right up against my own personal convictions. They might rub right up against my own personal preferences. And I have to be willing to be humble enough to set those aside and give my very best to the place that God has called me to. If that's you, know that I'm praying for you. If you're in a season of ministry where it's hard and you feel like, I don't know why you called me this, God. I am not equipped for this. I am not the right person for this. You are. I promise you, you are. Because you're there right now. If God had called you someplace else, you would be someplace else. If God wanted you serving someplace else, he would want you someplace else, and he would have taken you someplace else. The truth is you're probably where you are right now because you need to learn something. And it's going to pay dividends when you move to the next thing. And it's going to show its fruit when you move to the next thing. But that can't happen if you don't stay where you are and learn from the call that God has presently put on your life. So as you wrestle with these things and you wrestle with the concept of being called and being patient as you are serving where you're called, know that I love you, know that I'm praying for you, and know that in this life, it's only temporary. And God's call is eternal, and that eternity waits just around the corner at the end of our journey home. So I want you to do something for me today. In the comments section below, or in the Q&A listed below this podcast on Spotify, I want you to answer the question, do you feel called to ministry? If yes, write down why. If no, ask the question, what am I being called to? The truth is we're not all called to serve the church. Many of us are called to serve in the work field and in the workforce, and we're meant to be just simply a shining example of God's grace to those who need it in an otherwise darkened world. But it's so important for us to identify what our call is. So in the comment section below, or in the Q&A on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, answer the question, what do you feel called to? Thanks for listening to the podcast today, for liking and sharing. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell so you can get notified anytime I take a journey home. Don't forget to leave a review and let me know how I'm doing and give me a word of encouragement. I always appreciate those things. You can also go to aguysproduction.com to connect with me there. Also, you can find all previous seasons and episodes of this podcast, including today's episode, at ajourneyhome.blog. Don't forget to check out the socials below and in the show notes, as well as links to my merch store and more ways that you can support this podcast and my family. Now, be kind to each other, show faith, love, and hope to those who need it. Have a great week. I'm going home.